हालात बदले, लोग बदले, अगर कुछ नहीं बदला तो बाबूजी की सिखाई हुई एक बात, वो कहते थे जब नींव मजबूत हो तो फिर चाहे वक्त के उतार चढ़ाव कैसे भी हो, हम उनका डट कर सामना करने में सक्षम होंगे। बिल्कुल इस पेड़ की तरह ऐसा ही एक अटूट रिश्ता जोड़ता है आपके साथ IDFC फर्स्ट बैंक। विश्वास, पारदर्शिता और सच्चाई का, क्योंकि इनको आपकी सफलता में अपनी जीत दिखती। मैं तो जुड़ चुका हूं इनके साथ, आप भी जुड़ जाइए ना। IDFC फर्स्ट बैंक, ऑलवेज यू फर्स्ट।
प्रयास लोन, सिडबीज डिजिटल प्रयास पार्टनर जर्नी। आइए देखते हैं इस डिजिटल इनिशिएटिव की जर्नी। इस इनिशिएटिव में पार्टनर इंस्टीट्यूशन के माध्यम से सिडबी के द्वारा लोन प्राप्त किया जा सकता है। सिडबी की प्रयास स्कीम की मदद से अपना छोटा व्यवसाय शुरू करने के लिए उद्यमी पार्टनर इंस्टीट्यूशन के ऑफिसर से संपर्क करता है और उसके KYC डॉक्यूमेंट और बेसिक लोन इंफॉर्मेशन लेकर पार्टनर इंस्टीट्यूशन का ऑफिसर प्रयास ऐप में लॉगिन करता है। उसके द्वारा कस्टमर का आधार नंबर डालकर कस्टमर के KYC वेरिफिकेशन की प्रक्रिया की जाती है। पार्टनर इंस्टीट्यूशन लोन डिटेल्स और बेसिक इंफॉर्मेशन के साथ ही इनकम एक्सपेंडिचर इंफॉर्मेशन भी फिल करता है। इसके बाद पार्टनर इंस्टीट्यूशन ऑनलाइन ब्यूरो से डाटा प्राप्त कर आगे की प्रक्रिया शुरू करता है। इसके बाद पार्टनर इंस्टीट्यूशन ऑफिसर लोन एप्लीकेशन को पार्टनर इंस्टीट्यूशन चेकर के पास भेजता है। पार्टनर इंस्टीट्यूशन चेकर डाटा को वेरीफाई कर लोन एप्लीकेशन को सिडबी में फॉरवर्ड करता है। सिडबी लोन ऑफिसर प्रयास ऐप में लॉगिन कर डाटा वेरीफाई करता है और सैंक्शन करने के लिए सिडबी चेकर को भेज देता है। सिडबी चेकर डाटा चेक कर लोन सैंक्शन कर देता है। अब पार्टनर इंस्टीट्यूशन लोन ऑफिसर डॉक्यूमेंट्स की साइनिंग और स्टैंपिंग की प्रक्रिया यानी प्रोसेस शुरू करता है। इसके बाद कस्टमर और सिडबी ऑफिशियल को SMS और ईमेल द्वारा NESL से डिजिटल डॉक्यूमेंट्स का लिंक प्राप्त होता है। कस्टमर लिंक को OTP द्वारा खोलता है और उसके बाद निर्धारित डॉक्यूमेंट्स इलेक्ट्रॉनिकली साइंड और स्टैम्प्ड हो जाते हैं। इसी तरह सिडबी ऑफिसर भी OTP डालकर लिंक खोलता है और उसके द्वारा निर्धारित डॉक्यूमेंट्स इलेक्ट्रॉनिकली साइंड और स्टैम्प्ड किए जाते हैं। अब पार्टनर इंस्टीट्यूशन लोन डिसबर्समेंट रिक्वेस्ट इनिशिएट करता है और पार्टनर इंस्टीट्यूशन चेकर इसे दोबारा चेक और अप्रूव कर सिडबी को आगे भेज देता है। सिडबी ऑफिसर दोबारा डिसबर्समेंट रिक्वेस्ट को वेरीफाई करता है और सिडबी चेकर लोन अमाउंट और अकाउंट डिटेल्स वेरीफाई कर लोन अमाउंट
Good morning, everyone. Once again, welcome to the Inclusive Finance Summit Day 2. You are at the track 2, which is Digital Financial Inclusion, the need to trade responsibly. And we have the first technical session for the day. This technical session is titled Towards a More Resilient Future, Leveraging Responsible Digital Financial Inclusion for Improved Financial Health. And we have today as our speakers, Dr. Pawan Bakshi and Pia Roman Tayag. Dr. Pawan Bakshi is India Lead Financial Services for the Poor, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Priya Romantayag is Director, UNSGCA. Over to Dr. Pawan Bakshi. Dr. Bakshi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mayuk. Hey, Pia, good evening to you. Thanks for joining us all the way from the US. I know it's late out there, so thank you for staying awake, and I hope we have a good conversation.
Yes, thank you, Pawan, and thank you to inviting me to this summit. And this is what technology can do. You know, I'm halfway across the world, but happy to be able to join this convening. And again, thank you for inviting in this very important topic.
Thanks. So just to let everybody else know what we're going to be talking about, and I'm sure some of them have already gone and looked at the agenda. We're talking about towards a more resilient future and how leveraging responsible digital financial inclusion can improve financial health. I think this is very topical as we talk about it, because in the last 2 years during the pandemic, we've seen a lot of people fall into poverty. They've lost their jobs. You know, there's been a lot of pain, just not just because of the health side shocks, but also economic shocks. And we also know that therefore building a resilience and improving financial health are so important. Right. So I'm going to be throwing a couple of questions at you, Pia. And given your work in the Philippines and elsewhere in the world, I'm hoping that you will be able to share with us some insights and interesting data points and steers, which all of us, including us at the Gates Foundation and all the other people who are listening to this and watching you, are able to learn from and try and see how we can implement it in our businesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Pierre, the first one is around that we've seen that a lot of countries who have invested in the digital public goods have sort of fared better than the countries who haven't had that. Right? Mm-hmm. Why do you think investing in DPGs is important, and what is the right time to do it?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question, Pawan, and indeed very timely. Maybe I'll just take a step back and just share with our participants today the perspective where I am coming from. So as you know, I'm the director of the Office of Her Majesty Queen Maxima of the Netherlands in her capacity as United Nations Secretary General Special Advocate for Inclusive Finance for Development. And in this role, she has long advocated for inclusive financial systems for development. And, because we have, so much more outside the financial system and digital technology providing a very good solution, she has also long advocated for the presence of digital public goods to make sure that there is fair and equal access to the digital economy. And I think this message resonated more so in the pandemic, where we saw that over 200 nations rolled out or accelerated their social transfer programs during the pandemic, and many of them digital. And we saw that those who invested in digital public goods were able to more efficiently roll out these social payments, better onboard new beneficiaries, expand their beneficiary lists more rapidly, and really have better targeting. And even a McKinsey study looked at necessary public infrastructure and saw that the return on investment in that infrastructure is now 20% greater post-pandemic than it was prior, just because of the many gains that it has shown. In fact, one of the main benefits of having these digital public goods is that it proved to support SMEs during the pandemic, which is something that will have long-term benefits, way beyond the pandemic. So definitely, it is important to have, these infrastructure. And what are these? First is those that provide access. What is that? Connectivity, basic connectivity. Do people have access to the internet, or even, mobile phones that have connection? Is there widely, a ubiquitous access points like agents, or other touch points where they could transact and cash out? Are there use cases, merchants that are accepting digital payments? There are also public goods that are softer in nature, enabling policy environment, consumer protection laws, competition laws, which make it better for the consumer, and cybersecurity. So if we are all moving to digital, having these in place will make sure that this transition to digital is something that is firmly grounded on good foundation, and that's something that ensures fair and equal access to all. So I think the pandemic showed us how important it is. You asked me when is the time to do it. I think the time to do it was yesterday. And we really need a concerted effort, and it's really a public, private, whole of government, whole of society undertaking, because the benefits are indeed very significant.
I agree with you on a case in point is India itself.
Mhm.
The fact that we
Exactly.
had DPGs in India, India, just within a few weeks of announcing the lockdown in the, last
Hmm.
year, made cash transfers to about 200 million women within a few weeks of the lockdown. I think that was the quickest, and I think we owe it to the public goods and the digital infrastructure which India had. And I think I agree with you that the time to do this was yesterday, but it's never too late, and we should start doing it now. We haven't gone and done it already.
Yeah,
So
indeed. Pawan, of course, the example of India is something that we all look to. I mean, your direct benefit transfer, how fast you're able to do it. I think, the question now, not just for India, but for everyone who has optimized, digital platforms for these social payments, is how do we deliver now other services that ensure, the continued resilience of the beneficiaries? And I think that is something that, would really need focus and attention.
oh, you're absolutely right. And you started to talk about MSME, and I'd like to expand that a little bit more to also talk about tiny and nano, because MSME, it does injustice to the tiny and nano stores which we care about, and it's run by a single household as there. So I understand that while there is recovery on the way, it is these MSMEs and tiny and nano stores which will be very critical for an inclusive recovery, right? How do you think we can improve the capabilities and prospects, especially post-pandemic, when there is a wider acceptance of digitization? What
Yeah.
can we do to accelerate the recovery, and not just that, also allow these MSMEs and tiny and nano stores to be able to earn more money? And end of the day, it's around livelihoods, and if they don't earn enough money, or they're short of goods and services to sell, it will impede the recovery. How are you
Mhm.
thinking about what should we be thinking about these things?
Yeah. I like you positioning the tiny and nano question, because when we look at SMEs, and this doesn't even include what you're referring to now. We already know it makes up 2/3 of national income and half of employment worldwide, but that figure is much higher in emerging and developing economies. We know that. And I come from the Philippines, and these tiny and nano, we call sari stores and mom and pop shops. There are millions of them throughout the country. We cannot have broad-based growth and recovery without lifting as well, these enterprises. They provide jobs, they provide income to households. And I think, the we did see a lot. I mean, the pandemic did disproportionately affect MSMEs, those with no capital buffers, informal firms with no access to financing, and and even more women-owned micro and small enterprises were more likely to close and to finish their to close their operations. And so when we look at recovery without looking at tools for this segment, we are missing out a large driver of broad-based growth in our economies. And so so it needs to be central that our micro, nano, small and medium enterprises will need to have the tools, and digitization is one of them. Of course, we know how shifting to digital can increase efficiencies, but also expand markets. I know a lot of small businesses were able to pivot to online selling, to platforms, for example. So we need to harness that. And this will require skill building, and also, digital literacy. How will they optimize these channels? How can they better package products and services that are right for this type of platforms? And finally, access to finance. We cannot, support these enterprises without access to finance. And it cannot be, a one size fits all type of financing. And I think our fintechs and new service providers are better able to tailor bespoke products to these types of enterprises, something that is fit to their cash flow, fit to their needs. How will they take a product to the platform, for example, what kind of financing they need, sometimes even equity if possible. But so really looking at the skills that they need, digital literacy, expanding their markets, accessing finance. I think we cannot ignore this very important segment when we are looking at a broad-based and really resilient and sustainable recovery.
That it's a good way of thinking about it, and the question is going to be, is therefore what's missing and how do we address those needs? I think so. There's a lot of work for the ecosystem to do to identify those gaps, and then start looking at those things, because it's so nice of you to flag things that we could do as an ecosystem there. And I think it'll need a sustained effort and energy to be able to highlight that and deliver it on the ground.
Indeed. I think one way, Pawan, is really looking at, a more holistic digitizing the ecosystems in which they operate. And, it's not just, digitizing their operation in a silo, but really looking at the ecosystems, their buyers, their suppliers, their access to finance, their financial service providers. Because as we all know, that will generate information and data that could benefit these enterprises and the financial service providers that are operating there. And that will be very much, of course, driven by innovation, by the private sector, by corporates, but also, an enabling environment is necessary too. How is the data shared? What information is provided? Of course, looking ultimately at the benefit of the customer, which is in this case the micro and nano. So I think digitizing merchant ecosystems is key. It's easier said than done. There's many moving parts, of course, and so you're right. It's quite difficult. Another aspect, I think, is just really knowing more about what is the what is the characteristic of these enterprises. What do they need? What do they really need? What do they look like? And a lot of this needs to be data collection, and it can also be a public good, right? Because this could be shared in the market. And yeah, I think that's also an important piece.
So and you spoke about it, Pia, and I'm going to repeat it, that digital transactions during the pandemic have gone through the roof. Be it education, healthcare providing, telecalling, Zoom meetings, so what have you, and financial services as well. That we've seen a lot of this happening. But what we've also seen and heard about and read about is the gender gap, right? what we see, and you spoke about it very briefly in the beginning, saying that women seem to have been impacted more than the men. What are your views and guidance and steers on how should we? So one is, should we be prioritizing how to reduce the gender gap, and two, what are your steers on saying how do we start doing it?
Yeah. No, indeed, first being aware of the gender gap, right? And what are the drivers of that and understanding that. And in the recovery efforts and in putting in place, the digital public goods, we need to be very mindful and deliberate about addressing that. So I talked about connectivity, for example, but smartphone ownership, there's also a gender gap there. And so if more and more financial services are being delivered through mobile phones, we're already, you know, at an uneven starting point because there's also a gender gap in access, uh, with women less access. And so addressing the gap needs to come with really understanding the drivers and being deliberate in putting in place, the public goods, the products and services that speak to these, to the conditions of why the gender gap is so. And I think, more and more, I think there's momentum. People are seeing that. I think during the pandemic, we saw also a lot of social transfer programs that channeled their payments directly to women. We saw it, for example, successful rollouts in Togo and a lot of other places where channeling the social payments to women actually proved very effective because the women were really using the cash payments for the family, for getting access to nutritious food. And so it's compelling. The value proposition is compelling. And so we really need to coordinate efforts around addressing this gender gap and being more deliberate to close that divide.
Oh, this is great. So, what we've seen is huge, influx of players into the payments, digital payment space and credit space. I'm not too sure if we can build resilience on the basis of only credit and payments. What
Yeah.
do you think? What will drive this? Are there any trends in policy interventions or solutions on insurance or risk finance and other things which will actually
Mhm.
help build resilience? And I think the inbuilt question to this is, how do you even come out and define resilience? It's pretty complex, right?
Yes, yes. Well, no, first of all, your question on payments, we've heard it many times, right? Pawan, payments, they say is the first step to inclusion, but it should not end there, and in the pandemic, when we saw the social transfers, of course, it provided a lifeline, during the pandemic, but building resilience will not be had from these transactions. We need to have the tools. And what are these tools? The ability to save, to set aside a product that will enable setting aside, small amounts to build up a useful lump sum, or insurance products that could be delivered now digitally. And we are seeing a lot of good examples about, there's now InsurTech that's providing, not just only micro insurance where everything end to end is digital, claims, payments, is all digital, and also at price points and premiums that are very fit for cash flows of these types of customers. And so how do we make sure that we build on this, millions of accounts that were created because of the pandemic? How will we make sure these accounts are now used as a mechanism to deliver these tools for resilience? Of course, credit is there, credit, savings, insurance. And I think what the crisis did, and many call this a silver lining, is the digitization brought about a lot of new account ownership. I am afraid that if we are not able to build upon these accounts with products that are useful and that provide value and that provide resilience to customers, a lot will fall back to cash, and will not trust and see the value of these accounts. And so we should, this is a big opportunity. And I think, and when we talk about resilience, I think so that's the first part, of the question. I think that your second part about, what is resilience anyway, I think is a good point. And I'd like to segue into the work of Her Majesty on financial health. Because if you look at, if we want to try to get a proxy, the World Bank Findex has a question. When there is an emergency, and you will have to raise at least 1/20th of your gross national income, for example, will you be able to raise it? And only about 50% are able to say we can come up with that lump sum. And so we know that when an emergency comes, half of those that aren't able to will fall back into poverty or will get into debt that they are unable to afford, and also forego other productive investments. And so the impact would be great. And this is not an emerging or developing economy issue. It's a universal issue. In 2020, the OECD also rolled out a survey where the respondents, which include OECD countries, nearly 50% said we don't have enough money at the end of the month. And so, the concept of having buffers, the concept of being able to manage when an economic shock happens, which, is unavoidable, I think is a good measure of resilience. And in 2020, Her Majesty actually launched a financial health working group because, we're talking about financial inclusion. There's momentum around digital financial inclusion, but is this new inclusion or access to financial services leading to positive outcomes? Is it leading to better resilience? And the other, concepts of financial health is resilience, ability to manage day-to-day income, ability to plan for the future and meet those future goals, and also feel secure about your financial state. And the reason why this is an important question is that there is evidence in countries where financial inclusion increased rapidly, but in that same period, financial health declined. And so we really need to be very mindful now that we are in this juncture of, a lot of opportunities to build on increased digitalization. How do we make sure that we build on that? We provide products and services that actually don't just include them in the financial system. Financial inclusion is not the end, but really include them so that they could have tools to build financial health.
I think it's a great point, and I was going to talk about financial health as well because they're both interconnected, in terms of resilience and financial health. But I think you've raised a very important point here by saying that instead of looking from a supply side view, we now need to look at compelling value propositions for the consumer to use it, right? So if I think the way we've gone and said that in the past from a supply chain viewpoint that here's a product that we have and let us see how many of our citizens can actually use it, to see that the digital tools allow us to customize it to an individual level if need be, and which will therefore, or which can therefore, lead to higher usage and welfare, I think benefits of those products and services. I think that is critical because we believe that these services and products can lead to welfare. But I think that is what we should not be letting go of as we think about stuff.
No, I agree with you fully on that. I definitely, when it's products and services, it has to be what provides value and usability and, to the individual. And technology is really providing us at least the ability to do that, more economically. I think it was impossible before to make bespoke products and deliver them. But now we have that opportunity.
Right. And the other thing about financial health is, as I understand it, is complex, right? It's not very simple. No, it could be impacted by health events. It could be about education. It could be about environment. It could be about changes in the environment of flooding and fires and whatnot. A lot of these, what's happening today, then is a political uncertainties
Mhm.
which coming around the world, uh, and economic instability as well as it happens. So it's very complex, right? What would be your guidance to say what should be the business leaders or policy makers, regulators, innovators start to think holistically about financial health? And how do we link? Because the other is that financial services could actually be the link in between
Mhm.
all these things. And how do you think about it? What's your
Yeah.
take?
No, you said it exactly right that, there are many considerations and drivers of financial health, and financial services is just but one piece. Of course, income level is a basic, driver of and determinant of financial health. And, you know, there's many levers that affect that, and financial services is just one. But I think looking at the lens of financial health as an outcome that we want for inclusive financial systems can already drive action on the policymaker side. So possibly on two things. So for financial policymakers, I think being aware that the financial system and the providers, the ultimate goal is really to ensure the financial health of their customers and to deliver the products that lead to that. And this could fit into their financial stability mandate. We know that, a build up of over indebted, portfolios could affect financial stability at an institutional level, but also more broadly. It connects to consumer protection policy objectives, right? Because products and services, looking at financial health could be a measure of product suitability, and which is a core component of consumer protection, and of course financial capability. So I think, for financial service providers to be mindful that it does have those interactions with other policy objectives, and so it is in their interest to look at what nudges are they giving, in terms of policy. That's one aspect, but also in terms of how they regulate and supervise the financial service providers. And there's some examples already being done in terms of nudges that are being put forward in terms of consumer protection measures. The other thing is that it also opens up dialogue with other policymakers beyond the usual just financial service providers. And case in point here may be social welfare departments and labor departments or ministries, because there are cross-cutting issues when we look at financial health, pension services, for example. And so so in two things, for policymakers, it sort of sharpens and also informs some policy action, but at the same time it broadens the other stakeholders that need to be on the table. And I think what's good about financial inclusion is that, with more than 50 countries having national strategies, a lot of them also have implementing frameworks where there is already that interagency coordination. And so it seems like a natural progression that, this topic could be subject to that kind of coordination across ministries and across policymakers.
Yeah, no, this is a great thought. And as you were thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking about it, that ultimately financial inclusion is a means to a goal, right? And the goal could be resilience and financial health. But then again, the key challenge is how do we measure
Mm.
financial health of an individual or a family or a community, or for that matter, a country? And who should be measuring it? Do we have enough indicators now which we can be doing? Because as you said, it's cross-cutting. It cuts
Yeah.
across departments in the ministries and the government. It cuts across regulators and service providers in the public sector. It's a varied of things. And
Yeah.
it's something like, if you were to compare it, it's like the GDP of a country, right?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so
No,
if you have an indicator, I don't even know what indicators to
that
track.
that's music to our ears, Pawan, because I mentioned to you Her Majesty convening the working group, and there's really two of a few main takeaways. There is one, we needed to define it. So there's a lot of concepts out there: financial resilience, financial well-being, financial health. So we got around the table with those have been working on this field to come up and say, what does it mean? So I mentioned to you the four components, that it's a state. It's not the drivers, it's not the but it's the state where an individual or household is able to manage day to day finances, is able to be resilient against shocks, is able to plan and meet future goals, and finally be confident. So this one is a more subjective measure, is feel confident about their financial state. And this is important because it affects productivity, it affects mental health even, and physical health. In fact, those with financial stress claim to have more of these of physical ailments as well. And so it's really a holistic concept. But having this definition now gives us an ability to see what indicators we can have. So I mentioned to you the Global Findex, the OECD measure on resilience, but I think Her Majesty really wants a few indicators that could be collected cross country, so that we could have a benchmark and a comparison. Of course, it's very country context. I mean, it has to be contextualized per country, but there could be high-level indicators that could be compared across. And that's what the Findex did to us for financial inclusion, right? It gave us a measure, it gave us a target, a means to measure our progress. So similar goals for financial health. And, we're also pushing that financial policymakers should be interested in collecting the financial health of their population. But so that's one piece. But the private sector also has a role to play. I think there's a strong business case for financial health. Of course, if you have good, healthy customers, they're good customers. They will purchase, more ability to cross sell products to them. They're less costly to serve if they're financially healthy. And so there's a business case for providers to also monitor the financial health of their own customers. And we've seen some very good examples of this, banks that are doing questionnaires and surveys that measure the level of the financial health of their customers.
This is great, and this is also a good segue into the next question I was going to ask you. That to make lasting change, they say, you need all players in the ecosystem to come and contribute, right? Either is the government or the public sector or the private sector and anybody else. Do you think in some point of time we'll have the roles kind of well defined to be able to address the issue of financial health? Because as of now, it's a bit ambiguous, right? If you talk to anybody and they say, of course, we are trying to do what we are trying to do, but how does it impact the individual individually? It depends on the decisions that they take. Is because poverty, unfortunately, is multidimensional, and there's a lot of dimensions to that, and we might be addressing one or two or three dimensions out of the 15 that they may have. So then there is only so much which we can do. How do we address this gap? How do we have the governments, the regulators, the public sector players, the private sector players, and folks in the development ecosystem to come and contribute to and start to work around in this area?
Yeah. No, I think just talking about it like this as a start, Her Majesty started the working group. I think there's also momentum there and recognition that it is important. And all of us working in this space, Pawan, including you, we've been working on financial inclusion for very long. We've always known that it's not the end goal. And the end goal is really the positive outcomes, economic empowerment, opportunity, able to seize opportunities, and the financial health. And so if we recognize that and we try to, first define it and to measure it and see what we need to do to address it, I think that will really start the conversation going. And I think for policymakers, understanding the linkage to their own policy objectives is key. And that will really push the financial service providers to take it on board as a lens. Many of our initial discussions are saying some jurisdictions said, how can we think of financial health when our financial inclusion is still so low. We still have so many things to think about, but it is not, a step by step thing. You can look at it together, jointly, where you push for a financial inclusion that drives financial health. And so I think that kind of thinking and more learning, more research, answering questions on how to enable it. I think measurement is key. So I think let's work together on this space and really, get more interest and discussions around this, because definitely that's what we're all trying to achieve.
Great. So just also another thing, you've been at it now for a bit, and the Queen's office is looking at what's happening around the world. Would you have any examples to share with us how the private sector has gone and looked at in terms of the products and services that they've aligned, which can lead to improved health outcomes?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to share, there's two aspects of how the private sector could do this. The first is really within their own employees, looking at the financial health of employees. Here, there's examples like PayPal, for example. They felt very confident because they had good remuneration packages. But when they took a survey, their employees were actually not financially healthy. And so they had a lot of interventions. They have financial literacy. They provided options, equity options, and really have a very targeted drive to improve financial health. And what they saw was tremendous. Increased productivity, retention, and so the business case at the employee level is quite strong. On the customer level, one example, let's say in Australia, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, they really had a rigorous survey where they have a questionnaire for their customers, but they also track the transactions, primarily to look at the levels of financial health of their customers. And through this, they were able to design products. For example, like a planner, like a financial planner product, where actually it drove 20% of their non-savers to become savers, because of the product, which was designed from the information that they got on their financial health. And so again, a very strong business case. And the working group of Her Majesty is really hoping to share more of this information across the private sector and to global companies that operate both at developed and developing economies. Especially, there's also segments of workers that could be less financially healthy. And what do we do to address them? Gig workers, for example, right? And so, what are the tools then to address that? So those are some good examples, and we really hope to share more of those moving forward.
Excellent. I'm going to ask you a very crazy question now, Pia. And in India, if you were a student here, you would say this is out of the syllabus, right?
Now I'm nervous, Pawan.
So if you had a crystal gaze, right, and you were crystal
60
gazing,
days?
a crystal gazing, right? If you were crystal gazing, right? Where do you think we would be as a global economy in terms of financial health and resilience in the next 3 to 5 years' time? Where do you see us going? And do you think we'll reach there? And what do you think we need to do to reach there?
Yeah. 3 to 5 years is not very long. And so I'm going to be I'm an optimist. I'm a natural optimist. So I think 3 to 5 years, if we get it right, the things that we talked about today and, the learnings that we have from this pandemic, we will really see a more digitalized ecosystem that is more accessible to all. So it's not just, big corporates and big business, but even the nano that you talked about have access to this digital economy. And because of that access, there are products and services that they are able to enjoy and use, and that they are protected and they understand them. So that's assuming that we have, the digital public goods in place and all the necessary consumer protection frameworks and enabling environment. And because of this, companies are seeing the opportunity, of this broader market and incentivized now to deliver products and services that truly build resilience. And I'd like to add maybe, financial products and services that actually also build resilience of households to climate impact. That will be an increasing risk that households will face, and inclusive financial systems will play a role, and fintech and financial innovation to try to find products and services that address, that risk that individuals and households face, especially in developed and emerging economies. So it's really more a wish, I would say, Pawan,
Hope it
and
comes true. I hope it
yeah,
comes true.
we'll continue working on it for sure.
Yeah, and we are close to Christmas, so I hope at least Santa Claus is listening.
Yes, indeed, Pawan.
So just one last request from you, and now we are almost at time to go. So we have a lot of students and practitioners and regulators and policy makers, ecosystem partners, private sector players on this call who are listening to your guidance and your steers. What would you urge them to do now so that they start seeing change and we start seeing changes in the lives of people who've been impacted?
Yeah, I think, linked to our discussion on financial health is just being very clear that we all are working towards positive outcomes, right? And so whether you are a regulator, and I say this because, Pawan, I was in the Central Bank of the Philippines for nearly 20 years working on financial inclusion. I think, being very clear on the outcomes we are trying to achieve is important. And whatever player you are, student, private sector, is making very clear that the work that we are doing, the end goal is really to make sure that we lead to positive outcomes in people's lives. I think that's our North Star, if I may say so.
Thank you so much, Pia. This has been really, a wonderful conversation. And thank you for being the voice of the poor and the underprivileged and the women across the world. And our greetings to the Queen. And I'm sure her work and through her, your work will have a very positive impact on a lot of people around the world. And we'll all be thanking you. So thank you so much, Pia.
Thank you. No, I enjoy the conversation, Pawan, even if it's past midnight here in the US. No, no.
To keep you awake, but
No. I would keep awake for this conversation. I enjoyed it. It's very meaningful, and I'm happy to be able to share, the work of Her Majesty and the work that we are all doing in this space. So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Pia. Over to you, Mayuk.
Thank you, Dr. Bakshi. Thank you, Pia, for being with us for this conversation. Your long years of experience really enlightened the conversation today. Thank you once again. And thank you, Dr. Bakshi, for deftly steering the conversation today and even getting us to delve into the core questions of what is even resilience, how do you define it, how do you measure it. So thank you once again to both the speakers. And with that, we end the session today. Before leading the session, I will also like to thank the audience who have joined us virtually today for the session. And I will request the audience to stay back for the next session, which starts at 11:10, which is 10 minutes from now. The next session is Digital Financial Services and Data Protection, Balancing Innovation with Safeguards. So in the next 10 minutes, audience, please feel free to grab a coffee or tea and be back with us at 11:10. And thank you once again, Dr. Bakshi and Pia. Thank you.
क्या है जो आता हुआ अच्छा लगता है लेकिन जाता हुआ नहीं?
एक और हिंट, ये चीज जाती है हर महीने पर आती है 3 महीने में एक बार।
ब्याज, इंटरेस्ट।
लोन पे तो इंटरेस्ट बैंक हर महीने लेते हैं,
लेकिन सेविंग्स अकाउंट में इंटरेस्ट देते हैं 3 महीने में एक बार।
ऐसा क्यों?
एयू बैंक के सेविंग्स अकाउंट में इंटरेस्ट मिलता है हर महीने,
मतलब साल में 12 बार।
एयू बैंक, बदलाव हमसे है।
Presenting 2 new tech initiatives in the retail microfinance sector. Sahyog 2.0